suis très heureux de recevoir ce soir Raymond Meeks et George Weld. Raymond est un photographe qui a gagné une reconnaissance et réputation internationale à travers ses livres que vous connaissez peut-être, qui sont édités en très petit nombre avec toujours un intérêt très fort pour la matérialité du livre. Depuis quelques années, il travaille avec l'éditeur anglais MACK et nous avons le plaisir de le recevoir ce soir avec George Weld. Je dois préciser que Raymond vient de publier avec George un livre qui a été justement publié avec les éditions MACK à Londres, dont on va parler ce soir, qui s'appelle The Inhabitants. Et en fait, Raymond a gagné, a été le récipiendaire de la bourse Immersion de la Fondation d'entreprise Hermès, qui est une bourse dont vous avez déjà entendu parler si vous fréquentez la Fondation Henri Cartier-Bresson, puisque le projet de cette bourse, c'est d'avoir un photographe américain qui vient travailler en France, un photographe français qui va aux États-Unis. On a déjà présenté 2 sessions de cette bourse Immersion, avec le travail de Grégory Alperne, qui avait photographié la Guadeloupe, et le travail de Vasanta Yogananthan. C'était notre précédente exposition. Vasanta était partie photographiée à la Nouvelle-Orléans. Alors pour ce projet, Raymond a décidé de travailler avec George. Il a décidé de venir photographier en France et il va nous expliquer ce qu'il a souhaité photographier en France. Vous allez le comprendre très vite. Je préfère ne pas le dire parce que ça fait partie, je trouve, un peu de la qualité métaphorique de ce projet, de ne pas évoquer directement de quoi il s'agit. Ils ont travaillé ensemble et je suis vraiment heureux que nous les accueillions ensemble ce soir. George est écrivain, il s'intéresse beaucoup à la photographie, il photographie lui-même. Il a un certain nombre de projets autour de la photographie qui sont tout à fait passionnants. Et on a donc finalement ce soir une rencontre entre 2 auteurs, mais aussi une rencontre entre la photographie et l'écriture. Ils vont parler pendant à peu près 45 minutes. De temps en temps, je les interromprai avec quelques questions. Ce que je vous propose, c'est qu'on ait une présentation de 45 minutes et puis qu'ensuite, si vous avez des questions à leur poser, on fasse une sorte de session de questions-réponses avec la salle et ça sera ensuite suivi d'une signature du livre par les 2 auteurs. Donc je leur cède sans plus attendre le micro.
Thank you. We thought we'd start by thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to the Foundation for having us. We thought we'd start by just going through a few pages, reading the text, looking at the images, just to give a sense of how the book works and its relationship between text and image. And then we'll just have a little more free-form conversation after. But the book opens a word on a slate written in chalk, chalk wiped clean with a rag, a slate on a wall hung by a wire.
You did write this.
I know, but I can't. Actually. I stammer, I hem and haw, I speak with a voice as clear as a bell, words flowing like a river, my tongue is tied in knots. I look about helplessly, powerless to speak. I stand and the column of air rises from my diaphragm to my mouth, quivering with meaning, enlivened by a thought that shaped it. An unexpected trill, a murmuration. I picked it up and cradled it in my hands, and a small crowd gathered to watch and offer advice. I could feel the bird twitching, its feathers against my skin. I braced myself against the pinpricks of its talons. After a minute or 2, it seemed to recover its senses, and with no warning, it flew off. Everyone who'd gathered cheered. "You have a magic touch," they said. "Your healing hands." A cook's hands, a sculptor's hands, a thief's hands, a mother's hands. think it's probably enough for now. I think one way we thought about diving into this was Ray, as you know, has made many photo books, successful photo books, beautiful photo books, without including a writer. And so I wondered why you wanted to have me be part of this project, what you thought writing could contribute to this, and how you think it changed the...
Did you read those last lines that were... Thank you all for coming also. I think there, aside from some sort of practical or maybe impractical, I arrived in Calais without George, and to make portraits as part of my proposal that was going to include a series of portraits of refugees. But immediately the question was, well, what would be the scope of that? What would be the range and the scope of those portraits? Where would I begin? Where would I end? What are the groups, the demographics I would have to? And then, of course, the question of, after meeting and having experiences with some of the asylum seekers, of that transactional relationship between a photographer and a subject. You know, like I'd be asking them for something at a time after hearing their stories where like I couldn't bring myself to like want to objectify or to ask them if I could use their image for my book. Aside from that, a book like this that attempts to create a world or create a contained world oftentimes includes landscape, it includes atmosphere, it includes details of a place. It tries to create a contained world also by making portraits. And to me, that sort of prescribed model of making a book felt a little bit tired. And so I sort of welcomed all of these as an invitation to try to make a book where I was photographing almost with, like, imagining a person in this place, imagining what their experience might be, imagining, like, certain times just finding myself in, like, these beautiful places that refugees had crossed through, coming through Spain into France, across the Bidassoa River, and but also wondering, like, do they experience beauty the way I experience beauty as somebody who's been forced into displacement? Surely they must also, like, have moments of just bliss, you know, like being in some ways having an uncertain future, but also like certain freedom and certain moments of joy. And that was a long answer to your question, but yeah. Did you want to read some of those earlier passages?
I don't think so. I mean,
he's the writer, he does it, yeah.
So it was sort of a way of resisting a reduction of the world. I mean, it seems like the way our process worked was Ray came to France and spent 6 months working with a camera while I stayed in New York and researched and wrote. And then when he returned to New York, we got together with his archive of images and the writing I'd been doing and started trying to figure out how to make sense of these two big, slightly unruly worlds that we created independently to make something that came together. And for sure, I think on both of our minds was the question of how to handle this material, this subject respectfully and to honor the fullness of an experience of a person on the move, and also just to connect it with a human experience that everybody has had, which I think comes through really beautifully in the way you're talking about it.
Yeah, what is it to feel unmoored, to feel unseen, to not feel as if you have a voice in the world. But I think the thing that we share, I feel like I share with with most of humanity is an absence of form. Like I feel like most of us, I'll just say for so long, I mean, photography and making books and exhibitions and like the call and response that happens as a photographer has given me a sense of my own form, and as a human being in the world, because you're sending out like a signal by using a camera, and then you're receiving a signal back, and that signal back sort of starts to, for me anyways, and when I see works like this, and I start to understand through this dialogue of the book and this dialogue with an audience, like who I am and what I care about. And so I start to get a sense of my own form. You should read that.
Okay, I'll read this. First water, then land, first darkness, then light, breath into human form, breath into voice, breath into song, void into form, place out of no place.
Yeah, given what I just said, like that's kind of perfect.
Raymond, I would like to ask you about the moment where you decide not making portraits of the refugees. I would love to hear about, was it a conscious decision right at the beginning, or was it something that you experienced during the process? You say, I'm with them, I'm traveling, I'm experiencing the situation, but I don't want to show their faces. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
There was one refugee in particular that I met. His name was Walid, and I started developing a relationship with him, a friendship, and I just couldn't imagine. I mean, he even offered, you can photograph me, but that relationship with him then did take on a transactional dynamic where it felt like he was willing to do it for me because I was a friend, but I didn't want my friendship with him hinged upon that sort of transaction. And I also found that like at a certain point I had to put away the idea of making a portrait of anyone because it was getting in the way of my being able to experience them as a human being and hear their stories. And I somehow I believed that if I just gave my attention to that interaction, that their stories, our relationship would inform the rest of my work, and that perhaps I would invoke. There's the question of being inhabited also, not necessarily inhabiting a place, but being inhabited by a place or being inhabited by an experience or another person's story. And that might then result in something richer and something that, in the absence of the portrait, it left room for writing, but it also left room for the viewer to complete, not only complete narrative or complete a story of a person's journey, but also complete the image. And so, yeah.
You choose a title, which is The Inhabitants, which is the title of a Wright Morris book that was published in 1946. Wright Morris is a famous writer and photographer, very important figure in American photographic literature, or in American photography and literature. I would love to know why you choose to keep the same title, to make a reference to this very, very important book that was The Inhabitants.
We're both going to try to answer this because I think we might have similar. I mean, it took two of us to equal one of him for starters. That's pretty profound. For me, it's just one of the most influential image textbooks. There are dual voices, or more than that, actually. There's just the form of the writing in that book is so profound for me because there's a line, there's a conversation that's going on as a constant through that book, and then there are vignettes that serve like portraits of what it is to be an American, in post-World War II, post-Depression America in the Midwest, that is built over time, over a series of images. And I think similarly for me, like His images and text didn't directly reference each other. I'm not certain of that because I forget. But, yeah, but George could. And so just a wonderful title it was sort of a working title as I thought we continued to think about other titles and we tried other titles on, and in the end it became the default, more or less.
It was an interesting book to think about. I mean, I agree. I also had the same feeling that it was one of the more interesting interactions between text and image that I'd seen. And there was also something interesting about that question of national identity. I mean, it's so invested in the idea of Americanness and being located in a particular place, a blighted place or a place under stress, to be sure, but still one particular place. And the questions that it asks are still relevant in this context, but the context is so wildly different that it almost felt like there just needed to be another chapter in that discussion. So it had a very interesting sort of formal relevance to the project, as well as a kind of intellectual relevance, or sort of the relevance of its content.
There is one line from the back of, or from the last page of Wright Morse's The Inhabitants, where he said there was something about there's no need to cover an American, for an American can cover themselves, or something like that. And that sort of sense of independence was one that I felt like I could carry forward into this work as well.
The river is, there is a lot of photographs that are about the river, about the flow, about the question of something that is moving like water. And for me, this is what is the real strength of the project, that you are talking about migrants, that you are talking about migration, and you are not showing the migrants, you are not using the word refugees or migrants in your text. And in a way, the flow is a kind of metaphor of the mobility of the human beings that are moving from one country to another. And I would love to hear more about this idea of representing a moment in history, not by depicting with a direct depiction of what's going on, but through visual and through visual metaphors, but also through words that are more metaphoric than descriptive.
I think we thought about go ahead and turn while I jabber. Yeah. We thought a lot about the place where Ray had been, and the layers of history that had accreted in that place over centuries, millennia really, and how, the current, the feeling of crisis is real and important, but it's an area that's been contested for a long time, and it raises all these questions about home and how we walk on the earth and how we find a place that means something to us. And also raise questions of being uprooted and displaced and in motion. And it was less, I think, about metaphor and more about a desire to kind of create a world, sort of an experience for a reader, a viewer, to have a sort of parallel or equivalent or analogous experience of displacement and confusion and uncertainty, but also of engaging with the kind of important questions that emerge from being sort of living under threat or living under the pressure of uncertainty. I don't know if that's...
No, that's great. I mean, there's also, visually, a lot of the pictures are, to some degree, static, and the river. Just was a moment of me getting to be a photographer again and working with chance, and trying to make a picture of something sentient that has a pulse, But there was in the beginning, I was heavily leaning towards having the river pictures in the beginning, mostly because I wanted to give the sense of immediately being immersed in this place, in this world, And then the river pictures also, for me, provide, I mean, we're, as photographers and bookmakers, we're limited in, you know, unlike filmmakers, we're limited in the devices that we have at our disposal, including sound. But the river pictures, to me, evoke sound and evoke atmosphere and evoke temperature. These pictures were very difficult to print on press because everything wants to go monochromatic blue, and wanting to make pictures that aren't necessarily so cold, not wanting to embellish or, you know, but I had to turn this over eventually to Morgan, who is the designer and on press with me, and just ask her to make the best print she could make of the files I'd given her. Unlike the rest of the book, where I was much more, I don't know, demanding.
Sort of interesting.
Would you like to say a few words about the sequence and the way you lay out the book?
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, in the beginning, I wanted to start with the river, and then a friend suggested that we begin beneath the ground. With any book, it's that question, or with any venture of like making pictures, a question of where do you set down the camera, and with the book, where does the world that you wish to construct, where does it begin? And this book felt like, after it was suggested that we begin underground, that made total sense to me, that we would begin beneath the ground, unseen, in a world that feels foreign to us, in a world that feels like elemental and like birth, and then you know, surface slowly, and be in the world, still feel not at home in the world, and then remain, for the most part, above ground after that. So for me, it had a lot to do with that, of just deciding where to start. And then there's some form of progression, but mostly for me, it's trying to keep the book from the beginning, therefore, and moving forward, suspended. And so there aren't, for me, a lot of what I would consider heroic pictures. There aren't like images that try to do too much in a single image. I'm trying to mostly, I'm working in serial narrative, so it's like one moment leads to another moment leads to another, and collectively it starts to add up to something complete, or moving towards completion. You know, create that world, not in a single picture, but by way of a collection of images. And all that allows like the viewer to start to also bring their own imagination into it, and complete images individually, and construct a world that they can consider their world, or one that they can relate to. But this all happens in the editing phase. When I'm out making pictures, it's all projection, and it's all trying to find my own place that I can relate to, that I can respond to because it's familiar, or it's disturbing, or astonishing, or beautiful, whatever those things are. But it's in the editing that, you know, that you make choices about which images you're going to use and which ones you're not going to use, because they dictate too much, they're too strong of an image. And we didn't want any images that would make other pictures in comparison feel insignificant. You know, every picture carries a weight, and then, and to me, like not necessarily every picture, but the pictures in a whole don't work as well as other books I've made in the past. These pictures are much more reliant and inviting for text than I would have done in the past.
And I mean, just to be clear, like, you had plenty of showstopper images from this project that could have made a different book. So it was really a very careful choice to say, we're going to keep the sort of a steady flow, and keep a progression that can be, you know, recursive, or like, you know, you can dive in anywhere almost. It doesn't lead to a triumphant ending, or it doesn't have a climax. It's
icons or
Yeah.
decisive moment or things like that.
Yeah.
Have you been working together on the editing, or was it something that, yeah? Okay.
My hope for the book was that we would make something that where neither the text nor the image could stand alone. As I say, Ray could have made a book of like showstopper photographs of this area, but pulling back from that in order to make a book that made sense as a combination of the two things.
And then the writing comes after the editing
No,
phase, or did you work on the text at the same time? Or
I had started working on the text when Ray was taking pictures, and we both started working on. We met maybe 6 months after you'd come over here initially, and Ray had a huge stack of images. I had written quite a bit by that point already, but Ray had thousands and thousands of beautiful pictures to sift through, and but from the beginning of the editing, I was sending Ray sheets of fragments of writing, and he was, I think, fair to say, like adjusting the flow of the images or adjusting his choices of images to respond to the text that made sense to him, that resonated with him. Ray was a great editor of the text as well. Chose things that mattered, that worked, but they happened concurrently.
so that was mainly fragments of text. That was the way you've been working with fragments.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell me were you looking at photographs when you were writing, or were you just thinking about the oral exchange that you had together when you were exchanging on this project? Or
It was some of both. I started off with a lot of just general research to try to have a background in the area and an understanding of. I didn't come with Ray, so I didn't see it in person. So I was trying to absorb the world in a different mode, and for me that was sort of history and literature. But then when Ray started sending me pictures, I found some that I liked and kept them on my wall, and didn't necessarily write in response to them, but essentially started to build the world from the pictures Ray sent me.
I was going to ask you to read this one and the next one.
Okay. I was reduced to gesture, sound, an improvisation of my body, a desperate game of charades. Imagine not being able to speak, or speaking but your words appearing in the air before you as nothing but line, twisted into ornate and useless knots.
can you say a few words about the presence of Rodin in the project? There is a few photographs of the sculpture of the Bourgeois de Calais by Auguste Rodin. It's hard to see. It really takes time. It took me a few time to understand what it was. And can you tell us about the presence of this other history in the book? I'm sure you know the whole story of the Bourgeois de Calais. It's a different moment in history, a different war between England and France, and so I would love to understand what are they doing here.
George, you're better with the history of the burgers of Calais than I am.
I'm okay in New York. I'm not sure I'm going to tell the history of the burgers in France.
Phil Rodin's ghost just entered the room.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing about Calais. This work is so important, so iconic. It hangs over the image of Calais in the world. I went to school with one of the burgers in our art building. It felt like a familiar to me. I think when you were thinking about portraits, thinking about pulling away from portraits, but still wanting to have a figure, having some human figures in it, it felt like an interesting way to go. And I think the story of the burgers and the kind of, again, like that just thinking about complicating the border between countries, or remembering how contested this space is, thinking about, thinking about civic responsibility. I mean, the fact that the burghers were sort of the elite of the town who were willing to sacrifice themselves to save everyone else, like, it was an incredibly powerful idea for the situation we're in now, like, and so different from the situation we're in now. And then the sort of complexity of Rodin's depiction of them in this non-heroic mode, and seeing them, they feel so human and so sensual. Like, there's a kind of, like, the sculpture itself just raises so many conflicting feelings in me, that it felt very of a piece with this kind of the ideas that we were trying to, or the world we were trying to build.
As sculptures, also as a sculpture in Calais, these are accessible to the public, and you can, you see people touching, crawling on them, and they contain, if you've ever seen the full statue, the full piece, it contains every gesture of a portrait that I could ever hope for, and it just made me feel like there's nothing that I could do that Rodin didn't capture in these sculptures. And trying to photograph, thinking I'll photograph many times a day over a period of days, different light, and I'll come back with them and I'll see what exists. I mean, the problem is that they are inert, mostly inert. So the element of making a portrait with a being with a pulse and contingency, and like that was erased. How do I reintroduce that? But to me, I gave up doing that in the book. I still might try to do it in the exhibition by using chemical process in the dark room, bringing contingency back in that way. But in these pictures, the forms themselves felt like enough. These folds, these voids, these ruptures, these tears, these ropes, they all felt like the form itself suggested so much in the way of the complexities of this journey.
How is the book ending?
How is it ending?
How is the book ending? What's the last photograph about?
In this book? The last photograph? Well, I mean, the attempt, I don't know, I can't say that, I try to leave that open to the viewer in terms of determining the ending, and I guess we'll get to it here and you all can decide for yourself. But for me, it's always, it's not about closure. It's not about, not trying to create a sense of closure. I'm trying to, it's a new beginning. For me, it's wanting to, if it's wanting to do anything, it's keep it open and create space for a new beginning, and to recognize that, like, for me, all best endings are new beginnings. No hard click at the end. You're not just going to go to it.
I'm not going to go straight to it, but we were talking about this, that we had a couple ideas for an ending. And I was just thinking about how you changed your thinking about it from, can I do this, or is this annoying?
Fast forward.
So, yeah, sorry to skip so much, but
some of the finest text is at the end of this book. It just
this was a sort of a formal decision, or a formal move you did throughout the book. This sort of stacking of. Is this a stacked? I can't even tell sometimes. There's two stacked images, like where sometimes the difference between them blends, so you can't even tell. But the top part, the staircase going down into the water, at one point, I mean, for a moment, it felt like, okay, this is an ending photograph, like down the stairs into the water. This is the water, the border, the stairs, a sense of progression, a sense of landing.
Yeah, y'all are seeing a flashing yellow light right now on that picture. Like, do not end here, do not end here.
Yeah, exactly. So, which was sort of how, it was a question like, okay, we like this picture, but it can't be the ending of the book.
No.
How do you reduce it maintain its power because it's a beautiful image, and then complicate it and extend beyond it. You know.
It's a cliche, you know, as a picture with just stairs that go to nowhere except perhaps the water. And the only way I could reconcile that, even as a picture, was to use it as a diptych where, you know, I'm bringing some resistance, tension back into that cliche. Honestly, I'm still not sure about that picture. But
I mean, that's interesting in itself. I mean, how much time we spent wrestling over what to include, what to take out.
Yeah, this was a very short process.
Only a year.
Yeah, and we spoke earlier today at another venue, and it's, you know, in such a short time, there's always that question of a book or a work of art, sort of erasing the maker, the author, the viewer, and turning it over to the viewer, or giving it back its autonomy. This is how it ends, by the way.
That's it.
Sorry, spoiler alert.
When you say this is how it ends, what do you mean?
Oh, well, I mean, I think I wouldn't say necessarily what I mean. I think I would bow to George's text to sort of, I think, starting from here. I mean, sorry to go out of order here, but I think like this piece of text followed by the next one or two sort of feels like the ending that I imagine.
George, would you like to read the text?
You want me to read this long?
In this one and the next one. Or wherever you want to start.
Well, okay. Blistered asphalt and long low buildings and thickets of road signs and tangles of wire and the endless river of cars and buses and trucks. The parking lots and medical services and drive-thrus and the gangs of dumpsters lined up behind the grocery store, and the stacks of pallets and the banners and flags and pennants fluttering along the side of the roads, and the cement cylinders filled with pansies, the bulwarks and curb cuts and traffic islands, the road paint and flashing lights and quietly humming lights, and lights roving the ground in endless circles or tunneling up through the night sky over a used car lot. Do you notice the swell and fall of the earth where creeks might have run or might run yet? How did I learn to love this place? I brought your language back to you. I mean,
I think it was Robert Adams always quotes a writer who said, it was Robert Frost who says, "You want me to say it worse?" You know, and that's the way I feel about trying to answer that question about an ending.
That's great. That's really great. Thank you so much for keeping the complexity of what you are doing. I really appreciate that. I think, I'm super interested and impressed by your relation working together, and I'm also super interested in what you are not answering to. I think that's maybe the most important, what you decide not answering to. I think that's great to keep some voids and things that are not explained. So thank you so much. I think now that's time for some questions from the audience.
I'll start a warm-up question just to get the party rolling. I guess what I want to say is that what I notice in the book is that there are two worlds that are being lived in. One is almost a lyrical world, and the other one is a journey through a traveler. And I guess if I had a question, I kind of know the answer, so it's a terrible thing to ask. But I do want to ask, how do you keep those two worlds parallel without touching? I think it's really, what I really love is that I don't refer to the images when I look at the text. And I think that is a really delicate place to live, where the world of the words bring me into an imagination, and the world of the photographs bring me into another place. And I'm just wondering how it was that you two managed to find that place that didn't touch each other.
It's a great question, but I don't know that we can answer it. I mean, I don't know that I can answer it. I mean, aside from like, the boring answer of I work intuitively, I mean, that's, and we worked intuitively, and it's just something where you're just, George Saunders talks about like just paying attention to the needle, like the needle's doing this thing, yes. The needle's doing this thing, no, I don't think so. So it's just like that register of yes, these are working together. No, this starts to pander too much to the viewer. I respect the viewer. They're smarter than I am. I would like to ask George to read one more, because before we go past the Rodin, this one piece of text is to me is just so beautiful about Rodin that transcends Rodin. It's a long one too.
Steps around Rodin. I loved him the way Rodin did, with my fingers on his arms, on his shoulders, my hands cradling his stony fists like water I'd scooped from the river to drink. When he wore the noose, I shuddered, though I knew it was only his dignity and not his life the king demanded. I loved him in his ecstasy, his abnegation, his grim resolve. I wanted it myself, to be so willing to give up everything, to have such a sense of purpose. How much mischief has come of people in search of purpose? What am I going to do with myself? Where do I put my hands? I mean, we talked earlier about the problem of significance or meaning, or like a kind of a resonant, there's a showstopper image. There's also a kind of like profound, like a kind of artificial profundity that can emerge from an image or a text or a combination of the two that sort of feels good as a pronouncement, but isn't really respectful of the world it comes from, isn't humble, doesn't. And I think a lot of like watching that needle move back and forth was about like, not only is this too obvious, but is this too much us, too much grandiosity, too much foregrounding the ego of the maker, as you were kind of saying earlier, like trying to reduce ourselves, like fill this space, but also withdraw from it. So much of the world that came into this book emerged from a withdrawal. I mean, like kind of even that kind of cliche about talking about sculpture. I mean, like just pulling stuff out until this isn't trivial, but it's also not. It's not being an end, or it's not like cementing, or it's not making a pronouncement.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the process of laying out the images in the book, because they change size and location, and some are full bleed, some have white space, and so on.
It's mostly, for me, it's again intuitive, but it comes down to pacing, it comes down to rhythm. It comes down to leaving white space, sometimes negative space like this, to allow the viewer to complete the picture or wander outside of the frame. It's, in some instances, trying to take more monumental moments and reduce them, and then minor moments and give them precedence, every moment being sacred. Let you read that one too.
I'm not reading.
I'll read it.
I don't think we.
Maybe I would love to hear you also, to hear you about the materiality of the book. Why did you choose such a thin paper? The printing, what kind of printing is it? I mean, there is most of the photographs have a very dark tone. And so I would love to hear you about this decision while you were making the book.
I was doing a lot of the test prints on newsprint with a laser printer, and just because that's what I had, and it was inexpensive, and also because I liked the way that toner was looking on newsprint with the image sitting on top of the paper, delicate paper. And then as I started working in that material, it became clear to me that I wanted to make a book that made use of common materials, so it felt more utilitarian almost, that nothing in the materials felt precious, that the book feel constructed like almost like a journal or like a day book that, you know, someone might carry with them. But I also love that constraint and like the unknowability of like, this is 100% recycled paper that feels like we were trying to get close to newsprint in terms of weight. I mean, I'm really surprised by how it feels in the hand when the pages turn. Like it does still feel like first a recycled paper, and we had to print UV inks on this so that they would dry quickly because the paper is an uncoated paper. They didn't sink into the paper or bleed. But being on press, we were totally surprised by. We proofed things, but thinking we would have to do a varnish, thinking that we didn't have to do any of that. So it just feels minimal in terms of the paper itself, in terms of the reproductions. You know, nothing feels garish, or it mostly feels understated, and that's what I love best, is like using common materials in a beautiful way. And I like that constraint of having to use what you have, as opposed to constantly searching for, you know, the ultimate paper or the most lush feel. Like I think the book repels and attracts. Like there's a coarseness of the cover, you know, that is, I wouldn't say it's elegant in terms of like minimal means, but not in terms of necessarily the way it feels.
It'll absorb some history of its own too. I mean, I think one of the things that was cool about this cover is like, for sure, you're going to get chocolate in this, or you're going to get, you know, it's never going to come out. Like, and you know, what I wanted as a writer was like, I want a novel that like you carry around with you and beat to pieces, and then that beat up book that you've made part of your life has this whole extra sort of meaning to you because it's become part of you. And this book can absorb a lot. It will show its history with you as a reader, and you know, it's not like a precious book that repels or like easily sheds the world that it's a part of. It's going to get dirty.
Yeah, I got a lot of I mean, I kept wanting to make that beautiful object too. So let's do Swiss binding. Let's I don't know, at a certain point, like the slipcase became an issue, like, because George is just wanting this to feel like something he could slip in his bag and in no way feel precious or require too much of the viewer in terms of negotiating the box, taking it out, putting it back in. Or at one point I wanted to have like 3 different books, you know, because that's the way I was dividing the work as I was making it. And
what were the 3 parts?
I can't even remember. I mean,
At one point there were 12.
Right. When I got back from Calais, I checked in with Michael Mack, and I just told him we're going to need a slipcase because I think it's going to be like 6 books.
Encyclopedia.
And I was mostly just dividing them according to different means of transport. So the river and the sea, lorries and trucks, land, you know, encampments. So I was dividing them in a very traditional way, only to subvert the idea of narrative, mostly, you know, and not wanting to do a book that had a overt narrative to it. But then, like, George just pushed, you know, in his very humble way, pushed back against, like, he wouldn't have said it unless I asked him. You know, you have to ask George, like, how do you feel about it? And then he'll say, like, I just like the idea of like taking things out and having to put them back in, and like, you know, what do you do with the slipcase afterwards? So
For the record, Ray promised that you could throw the slipcase away if you didn't like it.
It's just a catalyst. It's just a carrier to get the book into the world and not have to put, because we were going to have to put a title on the spine, and that would have to have been silk screened, and I didn't want a silk screen title on the spine. So okay, we'll do a slipcase just to for the bookstores, just to get the book into the world. And once it's into the world, it's like the space shuttle, the booster rocket falls away and goes back to Earth. And
Slipcase's booster rocket.
yeah.
Can I ask you what camera did you shoot with?
Yes.
My camera got stolen through customs, so I had to use a shoebox, and then I had to work out the aperture on that thing, and then had to coat my film, and I brought a 4x5 speed graphic and color film, but I didn't end up shooting any of that. I just used I have a Fuji 50 GFX, maybe that's not the right order. And I use my Pentax 6x7 lenses on it with an adapter. I have 3 lenses. I use mostly 1 or maybe 2. I am thinking about, there's a part of me that wants to go back and shoot film because I miss, I had a deadline and I had to be able to see what I was doing. You know, I had to be able to interact with the images that I was making to know maybe what it was pointing me towards. That call and response that you get from making pictures in a foreign place. And so I stuck with the digital camera and viewing my images there, but I miss working in analog. I miss pictures that are informed by what's happening on the periphery when you're loading film or you're loading your camera with film. And it still feels digital, and working in the way that I did still feels like, I don't know. Like, it's not using for me, like, I'm not getting to have the experience that I want to have with the camera still. And so there's a part of me that wants to go back and might go back and do more pictures either with a 4x5 or 8x10 camera. Also just to create, and this would just be for the exhibition that will be here next year. Now that I've said that, I kind of have to do it. Since the curator's in the room. So that, yeah, the Fuji.